Welcome to Sober Dad Crew, the podcast where we talk about all things sobriety, recovery, parenting, music, tattoos, work, and more. For more information, please visit soberdadcrew.com. My guest this episode is Ray Donovan. Ray is the host of the podcast Stacking Days. We talk about fatherhood, raising boys to be good men, and how understanding leads to empathy. All right, Ray, welcome to Sober Dad Crew.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of things I want to talk about, including your podcast. But, first off, can you tell me how many kids you have?
Yes, I have two children, a boy who is about to be 6 years old, and I have a daughter who is just turned 4.
All right. The early run of things.
Yeah,
mine run the gamut from 8 to almost 21
wow.
because I got remarried. Actually, today's my first anniversary.
Can't wait till where I am where you are. I feel like I'm right in the thick of the early years. I can only imagine what it will look like for them to be in their 20s. So,
it's interesting because I've circled back to the beginning, and I feel like I have a lot of perspective on, parenting's a lot of work, right? I mean, it really is. I think to do it well and
yep.
do it as a dad in a way, I guess in some ways in our society, there's really low expectations on fathers, which I think is just a totally unfortunate thing. You shouldn't get credit for picking up your kid or making dinner or whatever. That's just part of the gig. But it seems like there's a lot of dads that just don't do that much stuff.
There's certainly a sense that there's a low bar out there, which I think is partially what we all need to buck up against, right?
Yeah, and there's the television commercial and sitcom dumb dad thing, which I really hate that humor point, because it's like, oh, dad's just stupid again, haha. I'm like, no, let's not set that as like the public image of the father. I think it's kind of problematic.
Totally. I personally don't subscribe to that archetype. I mean, it was really important for me to be a very present dad. I get a lot of joy out of it, number one, but I think that, there's a unique role that, a father can play in their child's lives. And for me personally, I'm a product of divorce, and my parents separated when I was really, really young. I was 4 years old. And not to say that my father wasn't a presence in my life. It's just that it's very different when you're just not there, right? Like my dad is still a part of my life, but when you're not there on a daily basis, when all of the nuances, take place in a child's development, there's certainly a lot that you miss out on there. So when I had an opportunity to have, my kids, I was all about, being there as much as I possibly can. And it just so happens that, my kids are young, and my daughter was born in the midst of COVID. So, I mean, I was very much, I've been there every day of her life. And it's been intentional, and, and the world kind of like, came together and gave that opportunity to me. So,
yeah. Did you always think you were going to be a dad, or always want to be a dad?
I always wanted to be a father. I always wanted to be a dad. It wasn't, I didn't know how it was going to happen. I mean, I actually ended up, I think, having children a little bit later in life. And my son was born in 2018. At that point, I was already 38 years old. So I think I waited a lot longer than maybe I had initially thought I would in, having a desire to be a father. But I think more importantly, I wanted to at least try as best as I could to have children with the woman that I would be with and continue to be with, to raise the children that I've had. So that took me a little bit of time to lock in. I've been fortunate enough to have a beautiful wife, and she's my best friend. But yeah, I've always wanted to be a dad. I had no idea what that would look like. But I always knew that was something that I wanted as an experience, and I wanted to give back into the world as be a father.
Yeah, there's certainly times when it feels amazing, and there's certainly times it is very not glamorous.
Yeah,
when they're sick or all that. But I also think some of the magic comes in those really quiet times, or with kids when they get into their teens, where I was talking about get the kid in the car on the way to like practice,
Hmm.
and they'll actually talk, because they're not necessarily going to always talk other times. But if you kind of get them in the car and you're driving, or with my 16-year-old, well, now she's 17-year-old daughter, those driving to school, just like two of you in the car, you kind of have a chance to connect. So it's a little different at every age.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to those moments where I've already started to establish, rapport with my children as individuals, right? I feel like they start becoming individuals pretty young, and you obviously are much more experienced and have older children than I do, but I can't wait until those kind of those years ahead where they're a little bit more developed, they've seen a little bit more life, they have many more questions, and we can kind of really get into those conversations. And then yes, I'm also anticipating the opposite side of that coin, where there's probably going to be periods of time where they don't want to talk to me at all. So we'll see.
Yeah, or there's the times when they, now with the tween, and she says something or plays a song, and I'm like, do you know what that means? Because you should know what that means, before you just go singing it at the top of your lungs. Then she's like, yeah, just listening to that with mom and dad, that's awkward. I'm like, yeah, it's
Yeah,
awkward. Yeah, you can just listen to that on your own.
Yeah, parenting is a full-time forever job, I suppose.
I think it is. I think it shifts. And like I said, having, on July 2nd, my oldest, he'll be 21. And, he's working and he's doing his thing, but you're still there, as a dad. It's just, there's definitely a shift. And he and I definitely talk about, more adult things, or we're talking about, my mom is about to move into memory care for dementia. So we're talking about that and what that shift of relationship is for him and his sister. So it's really pretty gratifying, to have built relationships that just grow and that are deep. And I've said to people, I feel like the groundwork of that is set when they're so young. Like if you don't dig in the way it sounds like you're doing when they're even younger than that, when they're 15, 16, they're not going to tell you stuff.
Yeah.
They're just not. You're not going to magically get some relationship.
That's interesting. I'll flip the script and ask you the question, because I'm trying to be very intentional about that. And I think that we're at a point where we talk a lot just broadly in society around mental health and development and all these things, and I never had that outlet in my parental figures. Was that something that you were very intentional about when your children were young, or now you look at it in retrospect and say, oh yeah, I kind of like inadvertently was very involved in my children's life and it played out to my favor? How did it work for you? Because I'm trying to be very intentional, and I'm hoping that it actually, reaps the benefits that I'm trying to essentially put those little emotional deposits into that bank account.
Yeah, I mean, I was really intentional with the oldest. I also stayed home with him for a year,
Okay.
which was financially really difficult, but really gratifying. I mean, their mom had the health insurance. It was a very American decision-making process. Like, oh, you have the health insurance,
Sure.
I guess I'll stay home. And that was really incredible. But I think, I always remember as a kid, every night, my dad read to my brother and I. We'd lay on the dining room floor and he would read. So that was kind of a bit of my model. And then my mom would always say, we don't go to bed mad. So if there's some conflict, we're going to work through that. When no one's going to bed and stewing on that all night long, we're going to do that. We're going to process what's going on. So I think those are kind of my models of like thinking and involvement. And even when I split from the older two's mom, I remember, especially with my son, because he was a little older, we did the every other week thing, and then we did every 2 weeks as they got a little older. And early on, I would read to him every night. I would call him up, and it was Harry Potter, which has since become really problematic.
Yeah.
Due to its author. We don't have to go down that road, but that's been hard. But we would read that every night. I
Mm.
would make time, even when they weren't with me. I would make that time, and I feel like it's really has paid dividends. Fast forward all these years and merging a family.
Mm.
My wife now has, two kids from her first marriage, and I have two kids from my marriage. I think the age spacing, helped that a little bit as well. But that intentional approach and talking through things, I think, has always been key, and we really keep that going now.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, I think intentionality is really important in parenthood. I don't know how I guess every generation has its degree of like intentionality, but I feel like it's much more prevalent these days just based off of the experiences that or the lack of experiences that certain parents did have in their own lives. So I think that that's great, and I certainly try to be pretty intentional with my children. I've tried to take a lot of lessons that I've learned even in over the last couple of years in my life, and some of the the changes that I've made to better my own personal experience in life, and how does that then get poured back into my relationship with my children collectively as individuals. But I do think I mean when you're giving something that degree of intentionality, and when you're constantly kind of being critical about how you're investing in those relationships, I think that's just an important headspace to be in. And it's nice to see that it's worked out for you. You have a son that's 21. I mean, that's basically a man. For all
Yeah,
intents and purposes, right?
and I always joked, I was like, I gotta put a male human being out in the world who's not a dick. Like
That's awesome.
on a basic point, like as a father with a son, I need to put a good man out in the world, because there's
Mm,
often still not enough of them.
yeah.
With him, I remember having all these conversations around consent. And that's the
Mm,
kind of like stuff that comes, right? Like, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about consent. And then I came up with, at one point, I can't remember how old he was. Maybe he was 14 or 15. He's like, I know. We've talked about consent like 100 times. And let's see if I can remember these. And I came up with my like three rules of consent, which were: you always personally ask for consent. And a lot of this was
mhm.
around sex, but consent is a bigger conversation.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
you always personally seek consent. You educate your friends about consent, because they might not be having this conversation with their parents. And number three, as he was getting older and going to parties and stuff, it is your duty to intervene.
Mm,
So I kind of
yeah.
came up with these three levels that felt, pretty impactful and like really simple, as like trying to put a good, any person, but like a good man out there in the world.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I mean, we can avoid so much headache in this world if we take the concept of consent seriously, right? And because I mean, it's all about respect, and I think fundamentally it's about respect, right? And respecting other people's space and their autonomy and their individuality and their personhood. So I do think that that's really important. I mean, my son is 6. I already, I don't know when you started having that conversation with your son, but I mean, my son is 6. He's 2 years older than my daughter, and we're already talking about consent, right? Like I think in inverse, she also needs to understand that how consent affects her experience,
Right.
right? And that it's a non-negotiable, and that's something that we already have started to talk about in our own home.
Yeah. And I think it starts super, super young. Like, obviously, you got to like change a diaper, right? A dirty
Yeah,
diaper, but there are ways to sort of present that to the kid, even when they're a baby, where
yeah,
you're talking to them about what's going to happen. And the better pediatricians I've seen sort of do that too, right? Like, I think it's kind of a lifelong thing. It just, like everything, it shifts as you mature. The kid matures. There's ways you present it at every age, to keep kids safe. I mean, my wife's a
yeah.
therapist, and she, works with, a lot of folks with trauma, and also
Hmm.
has worked in advocacy work at one point around at an agency that dealt with sort of sexual abuse and assault. So there's all these sort of threads tie in, um, and you need to like make kids understand really young,
Yeah.
really what that looks like and what is positive and appropriate and what is not appropriate ways for people to act with them.
Yeah. It's interesting, I know we'll get into some more stuff here in a second. But when I think about that, the scariest and I think most gratifying part of being a parent, you talk about bringing a good man, to maturity in the world, is you as a parent have a recognition of how convoluted. And I don't know if your podcast is explicit. You could edit this out if it's not.
You
And
can
how
swear.
and how fucked up the world is. And you have to take this, this very fragile, delicate, being from infanthood into into being a positive contributing member of society, while towing that line of not scaring the hell out of them, but equipping them with the tools that they need to navigate it in a way where they are contributing back into society in a meaningful way, and hopefully at some point able to take the reins from you and navigate life on their own, right, and become successful in those ways. So I think being a parent is both, and I say this to people all the time, it's one of the most gratifying roles that I've ever had the opportunity and to be blessed with occupying as a role in my life, and also one of the most depleting roles. I mean, it just takes so much out of you because the stakes are so high. You can only get it right once, with each one of these kids, and you got to be consistent and you got to show up.
Yeah, and I think there's another layer too. As like a heterosexual white guy in this society, I also have responsibility. And I remember reading Between the World and Me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've read that. And sitting there thinking, I don't have to have these conversations with my kids because they're white in America, right? Like I don't have to tell them to watch out for cops. I don't have to tell them all these things. So it's also my job from this position of privilege. And it's, it's related to consent, but it's related to creating like a good human being and understanding the world that they live in. And in this country, is founded on white supremacy. And as from their place of privilege, what are they going to help do about it?
Yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think that it's of the same ilk as the conversation around consent that you're having, right? Like the third pillar in your conversation around consent is if you see something that's inappropriate, then you got to say something, right? And similarly, like yes, your son as a young white man, I'm assuming, in this world, there are certain things that aren't going to affect him that he's going to have to interact with directly to his person. But he very well may see something in his community. He very well may see something indirectly that that affect the world that he lives in. And I do think that it's incumbent upon all of us to call out injustice, to call out inhumanity, based off of a very clear moral compass. Right. Which I think fundamentally and hopefully at this day and age in 2020, 2024, we all have a relative sense of what that looks like. There's still a lot of ambiguity, I feel like, for a lot of folks in that. But I think for there's a swath of us out there, both people who experience these things firsthand and also for, lack of a better word, quote unquote, allies out there, right? Who can also play a part in, calling spades what they are and being spades.
100%. Especially, I think we live in a complicated time.
Yep.
I think is the nice way to put what's happened over the last 6, almost 8 years, I guess now.
Yep.
And the historic way like a Donald Trump has played on racist tropes and getting sort of poor white people fired up to feel like, they're at the short end of the stick. And certainly if you're poor in America, you're getting screwed, right? Regardless.
Yeah. If you're poor,
right?
I mean, that's just a shitty place to be.
Right.
Period.
But the reasons you're poor are not because we have BIPOC folk in this country and not because we have immigrants.
Immigrants, right?
That's what you're being sold, but that is not the truth of it. And so it's more incumbent, to have those conversations.
Yep.
And I remember at one point I was on the soccer field and I ended up chatting with a guy who was a prison guard. He was American flag tatted up. I was like, well, I'm guessing I'm not particularly politically aligned with this guy. But, we had a really good conversation. It turns out he hates being a prison guard. It's emotionally and morally, it's terrible. He hates it, but he has to do it because that's the job he has to support his family. Yep. And we didn't even get into the whole prison industrial complex or like the way the quote unquote war on drugs, fed people into prisons after our government flooded the streets with drugs. I was like, that's like level 3 or 4 conversation with him, but it was enough to start to have this dialogue about, wow, prison's terrible for everybody. I mean, at least he gets to go home to his family, but it is a broken system. But it is one that some communities are getting just robbed of people as they go to prison, and other often rural communities have built entire economies around prisons.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly could, can talk about the whole prison industrialization, and there's so many layers to that. One of which that I think ties back into being a parent, and you touched on it, is that the prison system strips families apart. There's specifically Black men of color, brown men, where that affects entire generations to come. So, I mean, even for that reason alone, I feel very fortunate to be a part of my kids' lives, and I think that comes on the back of some really difficult life decisions that, folks in my family have had to make over the generations to put me in a place where I'm maybe a little less likely to end up there. And by no means am I absolved of the statistic. But at the same time, I'm in my kid's life, which is huge. And like to speak back to this gentleman and, talking about, us being in different sides of the proverbial ring, is like, yeah, we're all part of this thing. Right. And I feel like until we all and maybe this is a little bit too kumbaya, but until we can get to a place where we are having more of those conversations together, we're not going to be able to solve some of the systemic issues that we have in this country. And that's, for a guy who hates being a prison guard, like you say, yeah, he gets to go back home to his family, but the guy probably experiences like trauma every single day, and he's bringing that back home. Right. So it's not benefiting him. It's not benefiting his children. It's not benefiting the generations that are coming after, based off of the fact that he's subjugated to a line of employment that arguably could, probably look really different for him if, our country wasn't, in large part based off the fact that we thrive off of an explosive prison population. So I'll leave that there. I mean, that's maybe, it's for another podcast, and I'll hand it back over to you to bring us back in. But I think it's all, worth talking at some point with someone about.
Absolutely. I have one more point on that. Do you know Steven Satterfield?
Yes.
And his show High on the Hog, which was,
I love it.
It was incredible. And I was listening to a podcast with him on it yesterday, and he was talking about understanding is the precursor to empathy.
I think that's pretty accurate.
And I think, it was in regards to sort of race in America in the context he was talking about it. But I think, and to tie this back into sort of substance use and abuse, I think when we look at people in what folks like to call addiction and addicts, and I've been thinking more and more like, you don't call someone who has cancer, right? So the whole word addict is sort of problematic to me, but people gaining understanding of substance use disorder, for lack of better terminology, is why I kind of stepped into this realm of podcasting. Can you talk a little bit about, your podcast and how you got into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so my podcast the title of the podcast is Stacking Days. And, quite literally the podcast title is about it's just about consistency and stacking one day on top of the other, taking it one day at a time. And that's born, directly out of recovery and sobriety. The reason behind Stacking Days inception, and the reason why I still do it today, is in September of 2021, when I finally got to a place in my life where I could pursue sobriety after, I don't know, 2.5, almost 3 decades of consumption, and ultimately turned into abuse and unmanageable abuse at a certain point in time. I turned to podcasts in large part as part of my quote unquote program. I had gone to I had stepped into an AA room probably back in 2017, stepped into the room once, never stepped back in. And that was in large part because I just felt like I was the only one in the room, because I was. I felt extremely out of place. And and fast forward to 2021, we're in the throes of the pandemic. I think the recovery community in a lot of ways had changed. I mean, a lot more was virtual, but I didn't access any of that. I relied on podcasts. I relied on reading a lot of Quit Lit. And in all of that, I recognized I've probably at this point listened to hundreds of episodes of Recovery Elevator and This Naked Mind. And, there's a handful of others that are out at the time 3 years ago that I would tune into and still do to this day. And in all of that, I didn't really have for the lack of a better term, a one-stop shop where I could listen to other stories of folks who were either thriving, surviving, pursuing sobriety, pursuing recovery, that looked like me, that sounded like me. So I created Stacking Days as a place to highlight underrepresented journeys and stories, specifically from that area of recovery, from that area of healing, of growth, because I think that it's in a lot of ways recovery has been not crafted necessarily, but it looks to be a very homogenous space. And the last thing that anybody wants is to feel excluded, right? To feel as though that's something they're not deserving of, specifically in recovery and sobriety. So I created Stacking Days to highlight the fact that we are out here, that there are people of color, across, the diaspora, and, whether you be black or brown or what have you, that are pursuing this, this very challenging thing, which is recovery for anybody. And, we always talk about look for the similarities as opposed to the differences, and find community, right, in this journey. And I think that systematically sometimes can be a little bit more challenging for people of color, because there are just layers that they have to navigate that, maybe someone like yourself doesn't, right? So I created Stacking Days, not necessarily to address a problem per se, but selfishly to create a space where I could just talk to more people who looked like me, who are trying to kind of get through this really, really tough thing. And honestly, it's been probably more therapeutic for me personally than I thought it was going to be initially when I created the podcast.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was listening, even looking at the whole broader spectrum of mental health, right?
Yeah.
For non-majority communities, it is hard to find maybe a therapist with shared experience.
Yep.
And an understanding of what the added stress that different communities have. Just their existence is a more stressful existence than I have.
Yeah. I mean, and that's to your point, right? It's a macro conversation around cultural competency. It's a macro conversation around the type of care that that minority communities, specifically in this country, are afforded. And it's a huge problem, right? But I do think that dialogue helps move the pendulum, right? I was having a conversation earlier today with someone who was in long-term recovery, 16 years. And she's an author. She's been around. She's seen so much of the space and how it's continued to evolve. And we occupy this very small corner of society. But I do think that the conversations being had, I think that the understanding is now starting to come along with it, right? And I think it's important to step out of the shadows and be unapologetic in your distillation of your journey, so that folks understand that it's okay to to be out here, and it's okay to be a little uncomfortable and step into the unknown, because if nothing else, you're at least helping somebody else, and you're making the case something that folks can be aware of, so that there isn't that ambiguity around what a certain group of folks' cultural experience is. Because I think that also the problem is like out of sight, out of mind, and you don't necessarily know what you don't know. And that's another reason why I continue to do Stacking Days, because I feel like we're not a monolith out there, and everyone does have their own very specific story within the broader context and the broader similarities that we all share, as we try to get after our own development, our own mental health. So I think it's important, which is also why I wanted to come on and have this conversation with you, right? Like, I think it's important for us to be able to have the broader dialogue, and then also be able to have those more specific conversations in spaces where people feel real comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, and I remember early on, I just would tell people I didn't drink. Like for me, the number of times I've been drunk was actually really small, but I used it as this just numbing agent against anxiety and depression. And as I'm 53 now, and as I've like done therapy and looked back on my life, I mean, I remember having anxiety in kindergarten. It was the
Did you always
70s.
believe yourself to be an anxious person, or is that something you recognize in retrospect once you were able to sober up, so to speak?
I think really it was such like it was almost like such a fiber of my being from when I was a kid, and coming up in an era when no one talked about this. When I was in high school, people didn't have therapists.
Yeah.
Maybe on occasion you'd hear someone that had a psychiatrist, right? But kids now will just say, I got a therapist, right? Like there's so much more. Or even people in my workplace will go in one of the conference rooms and do their virtual therapy, and people know what they're doing and no one gives a shit. They're actually like right on. So I think there's been some progress in that, but it was really like getting on an antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and stopping drinking, and then going into therapy. So I didn't do a 12-step program, but I did a lot of therapy, and had, this woman who was my therapist who called me on my shit. I would go in and I would try and joke around, because that was my like method to avoid it.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm funny. I'll be funny. She's like, quit it. She'd call me on my shit. And that was really valuable. It wasn't always comfortable, but, I think growth comes out of the discomfort sometimes. So it was really just sort of getting healthier and looking back that was like, oh, right, that's there, and it's still certainly a thread. And, I was, for a lot of years, I was a single parent, and, there was my income and no one else behind me. And, I was probably not as good of an employee as I could have been, because I was so stressed or anxious about making a mistake and all that stuff, that I had to really work on that. Like, I wouldn't want to take a sick day, because what if I take a sick day and something happens and it's my fault and I lose my job? So, it's sort of a constant vigilance thing. And I really recognized that more when I repartnered, and I was like, oh, there's just this level, just parenting with another person. And I have a fabulous relationship with my older two with their mom. Like, we really like co-parented like champs. Like, we really, it's, divorce is not good for kids, but I feel like we did a pretty damn good job.
It's awesome.
We still do all the holidays together. It's just even more people now, and I sort of lost my train of thought, but it is this constant vigilance about your sort of mental and physical health. And I don't mean necessarily like being a runner, physical health, but the impact of what you're doing to your body if you're drinking, or, now as marijuana is getting legalized more and more places, that's also a huge conversation.
Yeah.
Because I don't want anyone going to jail for drugs, but abuse is real. So, that's another big conversation. Are you willing to kind of, you talked a little bit about your, years of drinking and such. Are you willing to dig into that a little more? And
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I started drinking early. I mean, I had a long career with alcohol. I started drinking when I was 13, 14 years old. And at the time it was more kind of as an escape tool for me, really. I grew up in Montreal, Canada. The drinking age there is 18. So you tend to legally drink a little bit younger than most places here in the States anyways. So when I got to be about 13, 14 years old, I was just spending a lot of time outside of my home environment because it wasn't the most comfortable environment for me to be in. And I found that, number one, trying to fit into a social circle, and then number two, just trying to like work through the I guess the awkwardness of being a teenager also in social circles. Alcohol was just a really great crutch for that. And what started as an escape mechanism probably still played that same role, but as you get older and you start taking on more roles, responsibilities, and starting to live real life, I mean, alcohol has different implications. So I mean, I ended up moving from Canada to the US in my late teens to go to college. I ended up actually trying my hand at college twice and dropped out twice. And it wasn't until retrospect that I looked back and realized that alcohol probably wasn't helping my college career. It was one of those places again where, drinking was totally acceptable. Everybody was, at the time I thought everybody was doing it. I don't really know. I know I was doing it. And but I was still using it to cope with a lot of challenges and strife and change in my life. And ultimately it was one of those, it was the substance that followed me everywhere. And I ultimately in 2008, I think was the last time that I dropped out of school. It was right in the midst of the economic crisis, and I was an ungraduated individual seeking employment in a really hard employment market, and found myself in hospitality, working in restaurants, which is another environment where it's very
100%.
yeah, it's totally acceptable, and everybody does it, and it didn't help me by any means. And so what started as a coping mechanism turned habitual for me, right? And anyone who's drank for any period of time, whether you're a binger or you're a daily drinker, I mean, it's a progressive thing, right? It gets worse over time, and the older you get, harder it is to bounce back from it. And and it all for me kind of culminated in 2021. I had at that point been I was working. I had exited hospitality at that point, and had been working in consumer packaged goods. I was in sales, which again is another environment where drinking is certainly okay. But it didn't work for me, and ultimately the pandemic hit, and everything kind of ramped up. And I think that I had always been like a drinker at home. I'd love to open a bottle or two of wine. I think by the time I quit, I was definitely drinking like at least 2 bottles of wine a night, which was kind of like my cap. That I knew that if I stayed within that range, like I could keep my shit together most of the time.
The
But then there
bottle
was
meter.
yeah, right. You know what I mean? Like I knew where I needed to kind of be before it started getting out of hand. But out of like every 10 occasions, there was probably one or two of those 10 where it got completely out of control. And then ultimately for me in 2021, I ended up going on a date night with my wife. And what started off as date night with wine and sake, which is really refined, turned into Jameson shots and IPAs, and the wheels came off really, really quickly. And ultimately, I ended up being escorted out of the bar and, did a bunch of damage in the bar and embarrassed my wife. And then ultimately ended up scaring the shit out of her. Almost, jumped out of the back of our Uber ride onto the highway. It was just a really, really messy night. And, at this stage, I'm 41 years old. I got 2 kids. I got a wife. I got a mortgage. I got a career. All these things that I've basically white knuckled my way to attaining in life. And I played the tape forward some, and I was like, if I don't get a handle on this, I'm probably going to lose everything. I don't know if it's going to happen tonight, but I'm certainly going to probably end up at a point in my life where I'm going to do something that I don't remember, that I wasn't really present and aware of doing. I'm going to present myself in front of my children that I might not ever be able to recover back from in their eyes. I might do something, that physically puts my wife in danger, physically puts myself, my own life in danger. So I'm playing all this forward in the midst of trying to, come back from a debilitating hangover after being blacked out for many, many, many hours. And I was like, I got to just do something different here. And ultimately said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I have to throw everything I possibly can at this problem that I've now identified. Like, I can't escape the fact that this is a problem anymore. Like, I can't sweep it under the rug anymore. I got to address this thing. So I went to my general practitioner. And mind you, this is after my wife filled me in on the preceding 24 hours. Like, I didn't remember anything, and I was like,
"How was the date last night?" You said.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to
Must
ask
have
her
been an
that
awkward
because
conversation.
yeah, I didn't have to ask her that because it was written all over her face that everything was bad, and it was a so yeah, that was like that would have been the light version, but in actuality it was just like she was almost like stunned in silence, you know what I mean, and couldn't really bring herself to the conversation. And frankly, we've been healing from that moment, from that 24 hours for the last couple of years. I mean, I betrayed a lot of of her trust and and our partnership. And fortunately we've been able to like step into a new place in our relationship and use that as a jumping off to heal a lot of the things. But yeah, that preceding 24 hours was really, really rough. Long story short, ended up going into my general practitioner's office, prescribed medication to wean me off of the cravings. And from that point on, I sought out therapy for myself. I was like, look, I had already been listening to podcasts at that point. I knew that there was like, I had to like come and like answer the call. And so I knew that I needed to address, not just like the alcohol use, but also the underlying, kind of symptoms and of the use. And yeah, so I've been on a journey now since September of 2021 to start unpacking, all of that that started decades ago, and at the same time, be able to step forward into this life of sobriety, into this life, and quite frankly, of who I believe that I am and who I should be, and a huge part of that identity is me being a dad and me being a father and me being able to show up for my kids in the way that they deserve me to show up in a specific way. So they're a huge part of my why. I don't think I would even have been here had it not have been for the reconciliation around who I was 3 years ago and who I would turn into if I didn't make some drastic changes in my life.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's listened to my little short Father's Day piece where I talk about like being a dad is the fundamental thread of everything in my life.
Mm.
Work, everything I do revolves around dad stuff, being a
Yeah.
father. And in that I also talk about being called dad is earned.
Yeah.
It is not given by biology.
No.
It is earned. And you earn it every day. And it's the greatest, in my mind, it's the greatest honor you could have. They could bring
Yep.
me to England and knight me, and I would care less about that So that might be kind of cool, weird, but cool. But being a dad to me, is bigger than any title at work I have or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't think I would take knighthood over fatherhood, honestly. Um, and again, my children are really young, but the one thing that I'm able to double down on in my sobriety with them, when I look at them in those quiet moments of the night, and I say to myself, "Wow, I can't believe I'm their dad." And I get to do this with them. And I get to do this with them with the clarity that I have now versus the opaqueness that I had in my life, 3 years ago. It's extremely fulfilling. And it means a lot to me. And it's not a role that I take lightly. And I think similar to you, it is like if I didn't have my kids, like my kids define in a lot of ways my purpose. Most of what I do is if not all of what I do is to hopefully leave something behind that's better for them and to help rear them in a way where they're able to create their own legacy. So I don't know. I for me it is it's like a journey like no other, and I'm only 5-6 years into it. I can only imagine how I'll feel about it when my kids are in their 20s, and it's like I'm 40 in my 40s now, and my parents are still alive, and I know the relationship that I have with them, and hopefully I'm fortunate enough at some point to be in the inverse of that, to look at my children in their 40s and be like, and have that same degree of awe that I have looking at them now when they're 4 and 6 years old. I'd love to be able to experience that in my 80s.
Yeah, it's something I always say to new parents, and my oldest is gonna be 21. It literally feels like yesterday when he came home as an
Seems
infant.
unfathomable. I
It's
mean, like,
it, I mean, I got a lot of freaking gray hair going on. Like it literally, I can't believe it has been that many years. I mean, I
mm,
look at him and he's, a man, but
yeah.
it just feels like yesterday. It goes so fast. I think in a
Mm,
way you can't understand until you're in it.
yeah.
The years feel like seconds. I
I
mean,
bet. I mean,
you
talk about
probably feel it
a
too.
humble. I do feel it. I mean, my kid's 6. I can only imagine what it's going to feel like when he's in his 20s, in his 30s, in his 40s, and I'm sitting there saying the same thing. Like it's just a blink of an eye, and I think it's very humbling because it certainly sheds a light on how quickly and how fragile and life is, and how quickly it will disappear on you if you don't take a moment to invest in the moments, right? So I certainly feel it, even in my kids being the young age that they are. But I hear it all the time from parents. So I sit there trying to strive on holding on to as much as I possibly can in these younger years, recognizing that all of these years are going to be fleeting. And I don't want to be weird about it, right? But at the same time, I want to be able to enjoy them while I can, because they'll never be 4 again. They'll never be 6 again. They'll never be 15 again, so on and so forth.
And I think like one thing I've definitely figured out along the way somewhere, and like I'm feeling again, like every age, like I love babies. I definitely do not want to have any more babies. I am too old for that, and I
Yeah,
had a vasectomy. So there's that.
fair.
Prevention
Not
taken.
going to happen.
Not going to happen. But like, 3 can be hard, right?
Mm,
It's like they're really trying to like grow into the world and find their space, but it's also cool. And there's like cool things about 4, and there's cool things about 10 and 15. Like every age, there's something really cool and gratifying with your kids, or like, watching my 12-year-old daughter just grow as a soccer player,
mm,
and like kill it out there and get all this confidence and like skill. And now she's like playing with all girls, which for her just is like really cool, although she plows them over because she grew up playing with a lot of boys. But,
mm,
there's just everything is cool. But the other thing I remember, because I played a lot of music growing up, and sort of wanting my kids to like find that thread and that passion for music and maybe like take it to another level, or I didn't, is I realized, oh, my job is not to like make them love the things that I love.
Yeah.
My job is to support them in finding and doing the things that they love. That's my
Yeah.
job. Like,
Yeah.
it's not about filling my ego about like, oh, look, you did this thing that I introduced you to, guitar or whatever it is. It's like, oh my God, you love dance or you love art. What can I do to like let you do that to the greatest extent of which you're capable?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I certainly I share that. I mean, I'm earlier on in my journey here as a parent, but by no means do I want to invoke my will on what my children do. Like I think it's important to expose your children to different things, but
100%.
yeah, but I'm not gonna be that dad where it's it's like I didn't make it to the NBA, so hey son, why don't you put those 10,000 hours in and let's go do this thing. Like I don't think that's fair, and I think it'd probably be pretty miserable for both of us anyways if we went down that route.
Yeah, yeah. I want to pivot a little bit to sort of podcaster to podcaster. I was listening to the last solo episode you did, and I don't
Yeah.
do a lot of solo episodes, and they tend to be these really short reflections. But in that, you're sort of talking about a little bit hiding behind the conversation,
Hmm.
but also this notion of, and I struggle with this. Like, I don't talk about my stepkids, who I view as my kids, but I don't talk about their relationship with their biological father. It
Okay.
is not my place on this show. There would be value to that conversation, but it is not my story to tell. So, like, where, for you, where are those lines, like, of how much you share in privacy and all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always a challenge, right? Especially in this space where you and I are the subject matter that we're talking about is inherently vulnerable anyways, right? So, trying to understand where do you draw the lines in the sand around what's appropriate to share or how is it appropriate to share certain things. I don't know. I think there's two there's two schools of thought. There's one where it's like you got to have your very defined boundaries around what are the no-go spaces. Alternatively, there is a school of thought where you act now and and kind of ask for forgiveness later. I think that when it comes to vulnerability, I try to be as vulnerable as I can about my own experience, knowing that my experience indirectly is also going to be the experience of others, right? But I think telling it through my own lens and through my own voice is important. Um, but like for example, my experience very much is intertwined with my wife's experience, right? My experience of recovery, my experience of myself. She has her experience of my recovery. She has her experience of me. So I've tried to invite her on the show, so that we can start having that dialogue. And that's my invite to her to enter this space that I've created. And she doesn't have to accept that invitation. But I think that opens up the license to touch certain subject matter that she and I have agreed upon. Otherwise, I try to be pretty careful about what I share versus what I don't share. But honestly, Stephen, if I truly fundamentally feel as though that it's going to help drive the conversation, and I truly feel as though that it's going to create an environment that potentially could positively impact somebody else out there who's struggling, I'll probably breach it. I'll probably breach it because I've already dealt with a handful of fucking fallout at this point. You know what I mean? Like, I, I was always like a high functioning guy. I still am. But in being very vocal about the struggles that I've had, in being very vocal about alcohol, substance use, and abuse, I've already aired a bunch of dirty laundry out there, and some if you listen to Paul Churchill, he'll talk about like burning the ships. Like I've burned a bunch of them already, and it doesn't hurt me. I think if anything, it's only made me stronger. It's allowed me to have conversations that I've probably avoided for way too long. So I try to be respectful, but at the same time, I try to be authentic, and I try to be vulnerable, because I think that's something that's lacking in broader dialogue today.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I get that. And, one of the reasons I do this too and in public is so that people look at me and say, oh, that guy did it. Or I can't believe he had a problem. And look, he's the director of marketing and business development for a major architecture firm, right? Like
Yeah.
that people can see. And I think I'm a better like human being and employee and parent and all that stuff because I've dealt with my shit.
Yeah.
Like I had an issue, I dealt with an issue. Like let's all like use that as an approach.
Embrace
Things
that.
happen, right? Like people make mistakes, you recover from your mistake.
Yeah.
People misuse alcohol, you can recover from that and you can like thrive and have a beautiful life.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you, and I also feel like when you're able to put certain things out in the open, those things don't have the same power that they once did over you, right? And maybe over, others who are also a part of your story. So it's not painless by any means, but it is a way to move forward. And I've probably experienced more ways than not in my life that I've not moved forward with certain things because I hadn't acknowledged them. So yes, I try to be really respectful. And if it's going to be if it's going to cut really close to the nerve, I'll probably as it relates to the podcast, I try to be really mindful of that. And I think that I need to be mindful about me mindful of that, and make sure that I have that conversation with the folks before I publicly talk about certain things on the podcast. But this is a safe space. And I feel like in order to be able to create safe spaces, you have to talk about things that, that are vulnerable, that, that allow you to have the license to have those conversations with people who are also talking about things that are very vulnerable to them. So I don't try to shy away from that. I think it's something that, at least the people who love me and support me in this journey have recognized and respect and appreciate about, how I've taken this, because I've traditionally been a really quiet, close kept guy. Like I'm not the center of attention. And I think I talked a little bit about that, in that episode. But I feel compelled to step into the light. Number one, to help personally for me to continue to develop as an individual, but also so that I don't shy away from the conversations that I should be having anyways, with all the stakeholders that I care about in my life.
Yeah. Are you a sober house? Does your wife still drink, or?
She still drinks. She drinks, occasionally, but she is, by no means has an issue with the substance.
Yeah.
And I'm not this overseer that is, I mean, she's got to live her life, right? And I need to respect that. And in turn, she respects the decisions that I've not made in my life, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're a sober house because we actually met during COVID, of all things, meeting in a pandemic and then getting married. But she's in recovery too, so that's a fundamental piece for us. I mean, I don't think there'd be an Alexis and Steven without. It was just important to us as like a relationship where we're bringing two families together. That was a fundamental. It's just a core to our existence as a couple. And that's not a judgment to other couples that aren't that. But when we met, on Bumble of all things, we both had something on there about not drinking. And I think it was in one of our early, computer-based conversations. I think I just said something about sobriety, and then that came up, and that was really I think a connection point to us that sort of launched this deeper relationship. But I think there's lots of of ways forward in recovery, and lots of ways they look. But for us, it was really a core piece of that.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that. I mean, my wife and I, we were together as a couple. I mean, we've been together for 16 years, married now, going on 8 years. So a lot of what we've meant and done with each other is kind of baked into the past. And again, like that's not her cross to bear. That's been my issue to kind of address for the betterment of us all in this home. But she just rarely ever drinks. But we all have our shit. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like even like we still got our stuff. But I think at the end of the day, like she's addressing like the stuff that she needs to address as I address the things that I do. And as we continue to grow as people and as parents and as professionals, like every season looks a little different, right? And I think that now we're in a better place because a lot of those things are now topics of discussion. Whereas at one point they weren't, for whatever reason. We were young, we didn't want to touch it with a 10-mile pole, whatever. It's not the case anymore, which I think in a lot of ways, as painful as it has been, honestly, we're definitely better for it as a couple.
Yeah, I think it's that intentionality, and that's what Alexis and I talk about is we built this relationship on intentionality because we had to, right? Because we were older, we both had kids. Like it was a pandemic. It took a lot of like intentionality and figuring out safety and all these things to like build this incredible relationship.
Yeah, no, I totally get it.
One last thing I like to ask folks is sort of as a dad, is there sort of any one thing you do that you feel is a little unique way to connect with your kids? I mean, the example I give is one guy interviewed says he gets home from work and he puts his phone in his office until his kid's asleep. Which credit to him. I should do that too, and I don't. But
yeah, I never pass up a moment to spend time with my kids. Never. I mean, and I don't know if that's unique necessarily, but I'm the dad who wants to be seen as the dad who's present. I want to be seen as the dad who's the caretaker. Like when my kids, when something happens and they fall down, there's probably an equal chance that they're going to run to me as much as they will run to my wife. And I want to be that person for my children. So I never, as best as I can, avoid an opportunity to spend time with them and be there with them. So I may not necessarily put my phone away. And now my son is like grabbing my phone and he knows the code and he's unlocking it in the whole nine. But I am very aware of the time that I have with them because I know that when I was 5 years old, when I was 4 years old, I didn't have my dad around to do those sorts of things. So, I pick my kids up at school. I spend as much solo time as I can. I jump in the bed and read books and and I'm not trying to look for a medal. My point is that I'm trying to be there at every stop that they may take so that they know that dad's there. And, and I enjoy it. I love it. I love being a part of those moments because there's going to be some big moments that happen today. And there's going to be big moments down the line where I want them to feel comfortable coming to me and knowing that I'm going to be there for them.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for being on. And, lastly, shout out your podcast and where people can check it out.
Yeah, absolutely, Steven. Hey, look, thanks for having me on, man. I really do appreciate it. I know that we could have kept going here, but as a dad, I got to go pick up my daughter from daycare. So, but in terms of the podcast, it's Stacking Days. So that's STACKNDAYS. And the website is stackingdays.com. And also on Instagram, TikTok, all the social handles at Stacking Days. And then, if anybody out there, you're a dad, you're struggling, feel free to reach out to me directly too. My email is rdg@stackingdays.com. So I appreciate you having me on, man. It's a good convo.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Sober Dad Crew is a DIY project by Stephen Kimball, who writes, edits, and produces the show. To support the show, please review it where you listen to podcasts or visit soberdadcrew.com to buy some merchandise or make a donation.